Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's lecture and discussion on the end of policing, rethinking public safety in a time of crisis with Alex Vitale and Alice Kim. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And just as a technical reminder, please be sure that you're on mute while others are speaking so that there's minimum background noise. My name is Julian Go. I'm a professor of sociology here at the University of Chicago and also a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture here at the university, to whom we owe many thanks for co-sponsoring this event. I'd also like to thank the other co-sponsors, the Human Rights Lab, the Mass Incarceration Working Group, and the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. And of course, I'd like to thank our speakers, Alex Vitale and Alice Kim, for agreeing to join us today. Today's event, of course, comes at a very tense and yet potentially promising time around issues of policing here in the United States. The Black Lives Matter movement over the past years has riveted the world's attention to questions of police racism and brutality in the US. Here in Chicago, these questions have also risen to the fore. And here at the University of Chicago specifically, they've become paramount as our community grapples with public safety and crime issues, and also as our community thinks about the best ways to manage and deal with one of the largest, if not the largest, private police forces in the country, one that not only polices the University of Chicago campus, but also surrounding residential areas with a jurisdiction that extends from South Cottage Grove Avenue to the west to South Lakeshore Drive to the east, and reaching all the way from 37th Street up to 64th Street. So questions of police relations with the larger community and with the university, questions of police reform, of defunding, of abolition, these are all live issues that confront us here in Chicago and at the university, and answering them requires deep analysis and thoughtful, informed debates and conversation. Given this, I'm delighted to host tonight's event, which hopefully can be seen as one part of that larger conversation. The way we'll proceed is as follows. I'll first introduce the guest speakers, Alex Vitale and Alice Kim. I'll then turn things over to Alex, who will speak on the theme, the end of policing. And then he and Alice will start a conversation about the talk and about related issues. Finally, if we have time, and I hope we will, we'll open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. So first, let me introduce Alice Kim. Alice Kim is Director of Human Rights Practice at the Posen Family Center for Human Rights here at the University of Chicago. Kim writes, teaches, and organizes around access to education for people who are incarcerated, capital punishment, police torture, and the prison system. She teaches at a maximum security prison, leads the Prison Plus Neighborhood Arts Project's community building efforts, and is a co-founder of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. You can learn more about the wonderful work Alex is doing by finding her bio at the webpage of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Chicago. Alex Vitale is Professor of Sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. His latest book is The End of Policing with Verso, which I know many of you have read and pored over, as I have. Besides academic outlets, his writings have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice News, Fortune, and US Today, among others. He's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, NPR, PBS, Democracy Now!, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. He spent the last 30 years thinking about many of these issues that we're now trying to grapple with, writing about policing. He also consults both police departments and human rights organizations internationally. And if you're interested, you can look up his webpage where you can learn all about his work. So without further ado, I'll pass things over to Alex Vitale. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us today.
Thank you, Julian. It's such a pleasure to get this invitation to be in conversation with folks. Sorry, my dog is barking at the door. Buster. So he'll stop in a second, hopefully. In the period in which we saw the police killings of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Sandra Bland and so many others in this period about 7 years ago, we were told, don't worry, we're going to fix the police. We're going to reform them. President Obama created a task force on 21st century policing that was filled with all kinds of procedural reforms to policing to try to improve police community relations, to professionalize police, to enhance the legitimacy of policing. But the officers involved in the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in the summer of 2020 had all of these procedural reforms. They had received implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training. They were wearing body cameras. They were operating under new, more restrictive language around the use of force. They had a bystander provision in place that required that officers intervene if they see misconduct by a fellow officer. They were operating under a new early warning system designed to identify potentially problematic officers. And none of it made any difference. George Floyd's life did not matter to them. And the conviction of Derek Chauvin has, I think, done little to change the basic problems with policing in Minneapolis. Just like the jailing of cops in Chicago has failed to produce some dramatic transformation in the nature of policing. The reality is that these reforms are incapable of making the kinds of changes that are needed because they profoundly misunderstand the nature of the problem. Let's look at one of the most popular reforms that has been implemented in many jurisdictions and was a central feature of the Democratic members of Congress, the George Floyd Safety and Policing Bill that failed to pass, which is implicit bias training. Implicit bias training is based on the idea that people have unconscious, unexamined views about race that can influence their behaviors in unconscious ways. And the argument has been made that the disparities that we see in police violence, arrests, discourtesy are driven by this unconscious, unintentional, unexamined racism. And that if we give officers a few hours of implicit bias training in which they're told about the history of racism, they're asked to examine their own perhaps unexamined or unconscious views about race, that this might somehow reduce the number of horrible acts of police abuse. Well, it doesn't work. First of all, we have empirical data now that increasingly shows it doesn't work. And yet across the country, money continues to be plowed into this reform because it gives the appearance of doing something about the racial disparities of policing without actually changing anything. There are several reasons why it doesn't work. First of all, we have a problem of explicit racism in American policing. When we look for it, we find it in the chat boards, in the Facebook pages, and the text messages that come to light. We find explicitly racist behavior by police officers. We know police officers are members of white supremacist organizations. The FBI has engaged in a number of investigations about intentional strategies by white supremacists and ultranationalist groups to actively infiltrate the ranks of law enforcement. But the problem is deeper than just a handful of explicitly racist police officers. In fact, in most of the big city departments, a majority of officers now are non-white, and in many cases, the police leadership is non-white. Instead, we have to understand the ways in which we have a problem of systemic racism, both within the institution of policing and more broadly in the political imperatives that shape policing in the United States. The fact is that policing has always been a central tool for the management of profound inequalities in society in which race has always been a major, if not the major figure. whether it is the policing of Jim Crow, the policing of slaves in the South, the policing of the ghetto lines in the North, the policing of movements for Black liberation. Policing has always been a central tool for reproducing racial inequality in the United States. And to now imagine that the disparities in policing are just the result of unconscious, unintentional biases that can be fixed with a few hours of training is incredibly naive and frankly insulting. And any politician who tries to tell you that this training is going to make a difference is engaged in active deception and manipulation of people's views about the nature of this problem. And that is because they themselves are implicated in another aspect of the structural racism that is producing the profound racial disproportionalities that we see with American policing. And that is the decision to turn problems in Black and brown communities into problems of crime to be managed through intensive, invasive, and aggressive policing. Nowhere is this clearer than in the drug war. What we see is that in wider, wealthier communities, problems of drugs are not dealt with typically through the criminal legal system. I often joke that at private elite institutions, yes, the dog agrees, sorry, at more elite institutions, if a young person is found with drugs, the police are not called. Why? Because the school knows that the parents don't want the police involved. Why? Because they know that nothing good can come of that for their child. There are no good outcomes of involving that young person in the criminal legal system. But in poor, non-white communities, the police are routinely involved in these matters in ways that have measurable long-term detrimental impacts on the lives of those young people. The police did not create the war on drugs, and they're not going to end the war on drugs. This is a political problem driven by political leaders who are using the war on drugs to solve a set of political problems for themselves. We know this not just as a theoretical question, but we have seen the concrete evidence. When the Nixon administration created the modern war on drugs, they understood that this had nothing to do with public health or public safety. It was instead a cynical politics of race. In the wake of the victories of the civil rights movement, the Republican Party decided to mobilize racial animus in the South by trying to convince historically Democratic white voters to switch to the Republican Party, arguing that the Johnson administration, by signing civil rights legislation, had abandoned those white Southern Democrats. Now, the Nixon folks knew they couldn't bring back segregation, so instead they signaled their alliance to racial discrimination by ramping up a discourse around the war on crime, law and order, public safety. Historically, the federal government's role in questions of crime were quite limited to a handful of federal offenses. But the Nixon administration figured out that because drugs often cross national and state borders, that they could assert a federal role in drug enforcement. So Nixon creates the war on drugs, launches the Drug Enforcement Agency, and creates a discourse that equates drugs with the problems of, quote, inner city America. And we know that this was just a cynical politics of race because members of Nixon's inner circle have come forward and have told us about what happened in these meetings. where it was made clear that this was a political strategy. Nixon's own public health advisors favored various forms of legalization and harm reduction. This was not evidence-based. It was not rooted in a desire for public safety. And the idea that the solution to the racial disparities in the drug war can be fixed with implicit bias training for narcotics units is an insult to our intelligence and part of a pattern of denying responsibility for these problems. What about community policing? Can we fix the problems with community policing if we just give our police officers more of a community focus? Will that allow them to tell who the good people are in the neighborhood versus the bad people, respond to the concerns of the community more effectively? This is the kind of discourse that we hear about community policing, and it sounds very appealing, but it profoundly misunderstands the actual nature of community policing. First of all, this idea that communities are divided between the good people and the bad people, and that if the police just focused on the bad people, that this would solve the community's problems. Well, the world is not so simple. All of us have sinned in our own ways. Good people do bad things. But also, community policing has never really been about that. It's been about order maintenance more than anything else. It's been about driving kids off street corners, clearing homeless people out of parks, criminalizing sex workers, etc. It's been about low-level quality of life matters that should not be handled by police. In fact, that's really the bigger problem with community policing. It's this idea of going to the public and saying, hey, all the problems of the community should be brought to the police so that we can work out the solutions to these problems. But what tools do police have to solve our community problems? Guns, handcuffs, ticket books, pepper spray. These are not the tools that are needed to solve our community problems. Do police have access to high quality neighborhood-based mental health services, medically based drug treatment slots, supportive housing, school counselors, high quality recreational programs for our young people? No, they don't actually have any of the tools that can help solve the kinds of problems our communities face. Very real problems of violence and quality of life concerns. So community policing is not going to be the solution to this. So we continue to hear that these superficial procedural reforms are going to fix policing. And we know that they don't work. And the demand of the last 2 years has been to quit trying to fix policing and instead replace huge parts of what police do with better alternatives that actually address the problems that our communities face. And that's really what defund the police means. It is a positive demand to create community-based mental health services, family supports, violence intervention programs, high-quality substance abuse services, recreational activities, mentors, and guidance for young people. But when we ask for these things, we're told there's no money in the budget for them, that the city's broke. But it turns out one of the reasons they're broke is that the money is all going to the police department. 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45% of some local city police department, city budgets is going to the police department. this is a huge expenditure that often has very little value to show for itself. And we have concrete evidence that shows the effectiveness of alternative interventions in a whole range of public safety matters, whether it's violence reduction spending, to pay for credible messengers, to work in communities that are experience violence from a position of mutual understanding and respect. When these programs are well run and well funded, they have shown tremendously positive results in dramatically reducing shootings and killings in the targeted areas. Now, sometimes we hear about a particular program that didn't work or where there was a problem. And yes, with any intervention, there will be imperfections, but we have a growing body of evidence about the effectiveness of these programs. So in the face of this body of evidence, why is it that we persist in assuming that we can solve our problems through policing? Well, I think there are a couple things to consider here. One is that our political leaders are too often committed to a kind of naive legal formalistic view of the world, in which they assume that if we could just create a stable legal framework and have the police professionally and neutrally enforce that legal framework, that this will benefit everyone equally. But this is naive on two counts. First, the legal frames that we expect the police to operate under do not benefit everyone equally. There's a famous 19th century saying, "The law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets." The reality is that our legal systems have been tools for producing inequality in a wide variety of ways. But in addition to the problems with the legal frameworks that include things like the war on drugs, the criminalization of homelessness and mental health problems, the criminalization of young people in schools, in addition to that, there's the reality that policing always extends far beyond what is in the law books. Much more than enforcing the law, policing has historically been a tool for producing order. An order that does not benefit everyone equally. In fact, the origins of policing as an institution are explicitly and deeply rooted in the facilitation of the most extreme regimes of exploitation that were present in the 18th and 19th centuries when they were created. In the United States, this involves the management of slavery, colonialism, and mass industrialization. In the states of the South, we see during the slavery period, especially in urban areas like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, police forces created to manage what are essentially large mobile slave populations. We're not talking about, oh, slave patrols somehow became police. No, police departments with uniforms, professional standards, engaged in law enforcement exclusively, are enforcing the laws of slavery. And they are needed to manage resistance to those laws of slavery. In the western part of the US, policing, like the Texas Rangers, emerges out of colonialism. They are created to help exterminate and drive out indigenous populations, and also to push out historic Spanish and Mexican landholders to make way for white settlement. In the North, however, policing is often completely independent of direct involvement in slavery or colonialism, perhaps returning a few caught slaves. Instead, they are created to manage the social problems that emerge from mass industrialization. As the cities of the North are flooded with immigrants from Europe, who are largely coming from rural spaces, who are flooding into the industrial economy, policing is being used to manage riots, strikes, working class pleasures that are deemed disorderly, and to suppress the political mobilization of these communities. So policing has emerged as a tool for managing threats to the existing order. And we live today not in a society with slavery and colonialism in some 19th century sense. We barely have industrialization. Instead, what we have is neoliberal austerity. The massive redistribution of wealth from the poor and middle classes to the extremely rich. And policing has been a central tool for managing that problem. Local places have come under tremendous pressure with the advent of neoliberal globalization to try to retain capital through subsidies, deregulation, and tax breaks, in the hopes that certain economic actors will be so competitive on the global stage that some of their wealth will magically trickle down to the rest of us. But that's not what's happened. What's happened is that wealth has gone shooting up the economic ladder, creating a cohort of billionaires, while local, state, and federal governments have struggled to meet their most basic obligations. So while a huge chunk of money is going into policing, a whole other set of resources are being used to subsidize the rich, making it impossible to provide basic services. And the result of that has been mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems, failed schools, mass involvement in black market activity like drugs, sex work, and stolen goods to help people manage in these difficult times of profound economic precarity for the poor. And policing has been used to manage those problems, to turn those problems into problems of crime that are labeled problems of moral failure that will only respond to punitive and coercive interventions. And that is why anytime we see a problem turned over to policing, we should be looking at the ways in which that is enabling this process of producing austerity. It is providing political cover for elected officials who are complicit in the defunding of our schools, our communities, and our humanity. And policing fails to deliver. It does not produce the kind of safety we think it does. And even if we want to claim in some sense that it works, it comes at huge expense. Not just budgetary expense, but also the cost of lives lost, lives ruined, lives made worse. Police in the United States themselves are responsible for about 7% of all homicides in the country. And they are responsible for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of injuries and traumatizing encounters with the public. We have public safety data, public health data that shows being subjected to intensive policing actually reduces people's health measures, reduces their life expectancy. And there's one final cost. It's an ideological cost. When we mobilize policing to solve our problems, we're buying into the analysis that says that our problems are the result of individual and group moral failure, not disinvestment, not the defunding of our communities. It says, no, The problems on the south side of Chicago, for instance, are because there are bad people there who need to be wiped out through intensive criminalization. And we cannot accept that. Every time we mobilize policing, we reinforce that ideology. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm very happy to be in conversation with Alice, and then a little bit later to take some questions from everyone else today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Wonderful. Alice, I'd like to invite you now to lead us off in a conversation, please.
Sure. Well, thanks, Alex, so much for that really great talk. Your book, End of Policing, is a mainstay in my classes, and I know it's been so incredibly useful to organizers really in cities across the country. So just want to lift that up. I also want to lift up the people who have been doing this work to end police violence, to get us to shift, fundamentally shift our way of thinking around policing and public safety. I know many of them are in the room right now as we speak. Groups like Love and Protect, Acting Outside, the students at University of Chicago involved in Care Not Cops, Families for Justice. Araywa Winters is on the call. Anthony Holmes is a torture survivor who was tortured by John Burge. He works with the Chicago Torture Justice Center and also Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. He's in the Zoom room here. Monica Cosby. So many others. Just want to lift up that work, and really would like our discussion to take what you have been talking about and what you have been writing about, and really connect it to this kind of on the ground organizing work that folks have been doing around the country. You know, you talked about defunding the police. I think that was an abolitionist demand that was brought to the fore after George Floyd was killed and people were out in the streets. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk about examples and share some examples where that call and that demand has been met, and also maybe some of the challenges that we've faced in meeting that demand. Because I think in Minnesota, for example, you know, some strides were made, and it can feel like one step forward, two steps back, because there can be some defunding that happens, and then it's brought back. Funding is brought back. Or at the University of Minnesota, I think initial calls to sever the relationship between the university and the police were met, and then, you know, the next term rolls around, and I think the university comes back and, you know, increases funding once again. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah. So, you know, obviously we're experiencing this profound backlash at the moment. Elected officials, mainstream media, doing everything they can to discount, discredit, and isolate the ideas that emerged during the protests of 2020. And that's because they remain committed to austerity politics. They remain committed to a fundamental economic vision that requires policing to bail them out of their self-made problems. So there's been a lot of discussion, though, during this backlash. Well, was defund the police the right term? Did that alienate people? Now, I didn't have any particular allegiance to that three-word term. That was not a term I ever used before it emerged in 2020, specifically, as my understanding, out of efforts in Minneapolis that have been ongoing. But there was a robust movement underway all across the country to divest and reinvest, to shift resources, and also to autonomously develop community-based public safety interventions through the, let's call it the transformative justice movement, which is incredibly powerful, fascinating thing. So that work was going on. And then, and I think, and people were in conversation, people were in conversation prior to 2020. There were some national gatherings. There was a lot of networking happening. And I can tell you, nobody in that room thought that we were on the precipice of achieving police abolition or having this be a primary topic of conversation in national politics. We were focused, and I say we because I'm actively involved with these movements, we were focused on building these ideas at the community level, building out concrete examples, right? And moving incrementally, usually through almost entirely local politics and local organizing. When this got put on the front pages and the mainstream media got involved and the big politicians got involved, what matters to them is who's going to win the next election in 3 months. And any other political consideration just goes right out the window. So anything that they don't think they can weaponize for short-term political advantage, they're against it. In addition to the fact that they actually still completely embrace austerity politics. But we are winning things because the logic and the evidence behind this has become indisputable. People understand that police should not be in the mental health business. They should not be in the school discipline business. Increasingly, people understand they should not be in the drug business or the sex work business. Even people understand they shouldn't even be in the violence business in many cases, the corruption and abuse and ineffectiveness of policing. So what are we seeing concretely? Well, we're seeing two types of developments. One is we're seeing the continued growth of autonomous community-based public safety initiatives, mutual aid, self-help, community mobilization efforts within organizations, within networks of friends, within local communities to try to address harmful behavior without involving the state and particularly the criminal legal system. There's a great new handbook that's out through AK Press, I believe, that goes into great detail. The work of folks like Jurisdiction and Miriam Kaba have been incredibly important in giving people a vision about how to think about their own role in producing public safety and the need to organize that outside of the criminal legal system. In addition, there have been state interventions that I think some of which have been quite positive. A growing number of localities that are trying to figure out how to reduce the scope of policing. Many places that have ended school policing, from Oakland, California to Portland, Maine, with major campaigns underway in LA County and a number of other places across the country. Another area has been getting the police out of crisis response, responding to mental health, substance abuse, homelessness related crises. I think everyone appreciates the idea now that this is a terrible idea to send police. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And police are just simply the wrong agency to send. And so Denver's STARS program, for instance, has been able to divert a significant number of 911 calls to a civilian crisis team in which police backup has not been requested one single time. No arrests have been made and no one has been injured. We can save lives this way, and a growing number of cities are exploring these possibilities. The risk, though, is that in the absence of creating more actual community mental health services, even outreach teams will have difficulty effectively managing someone having a crisis. So we need to keep the pressure on to improve services, not just crisis response.
Great. I think folks are asking for the title of the handbook that you referenced.
Yeah, I'm gonna just get that out here in just a second. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it. I just got it in the mail, so
I see that Dina Lewis posted fumbling towards repair, but I think you're talking about something else.
It's brand new. But let's go ahead with questions and it will come to me.
Today is actually a big day, right? In New York, the president is meeting with the New York governor and also the mayor of New York City, right? To talk about solutions to gun violence. And I know that you actually tweeted and posted the New York ACLU's statement, which is a really lovely and eloquent statement calling for investment in our communities, not more policing. But you talked about community policing and how well, you talked about community policing, and it's a nice way of talking about more policing, right? I'm in this moment, right, where we have our elected public leaders coming together to talk about the gun violence crisis that we're seeing. We see it's very true. We see groups like the ACLU coming out with these kinds of statements, and there's growing numbers of people in the US who are seeing the need for investing in our communities, not more policing, but yet our leaders are still calling for more policing. They might say more community policing instead of more policing, but they're still calling for that. So given this and given the backlash, what is your assessment of the call to defund the police, where the prison and police abolitionist movements are at today, and what people need to be doing in this particular moment?
Well, I think one of the limitations of defund the police as a strategy, as a rhetorical tool, is that the emphasis was on the negative aspects of it, by which I mean the harms of policing and the need to reduce our reliance on policing. What it failed to capture was the positive side, the aspirational side, the what would we do differently side. And I think that in this moment, we need to put much more focus on the positive side. What is it that we want? What are the kinds of services, interventions that would make our communities healthier, safer places? And what I've seen traveling around the country, either in person before COVID or virtually, is that when folks mobilize at the neighborhood level around a positive vision for public safety, that is when they win victories. But it's these positive visions are encased in an abolitionist analysis that prevents us from getting diverted into support for pointless reforms that don't deliver.
Right. I think that there's what you're saying is really resonating with me. Here in Chicago, we have the John Birch torture cases. John Birch tortured over 120 Black people between the span of 1972 and 1991. Torture survivors insisted that their lives mattered. There was 40 years of struggle, really, over in response to these cases. John Birch was ultimately and finally prosecuted. In that moment when he was prosecuted and convicted, many of us who were part of these battles felt that it was a really empty victory, right? Takes 40 years to get him prosecuted, not even for the crime of torture, but we're left with this glaring reality that torture survived, where was the justice that torture survivors' needs were still unmet. They were still suffering from the trauma of torture. And so fighting and calling for reparations became a central demand of ours. And I think it really was a different kind of demand. So many of our fights around police violence have been very reactive to instances of police killings, police violence. And in this sense, we were actually trying to fight for something that, gave a vision of a kind of abolitionist future, right? The reparations was not just financial compensation. Many people mistake it for that, but it was a school curriculum in Chicago public schools about the John Birch torture cases. It was the development and the creation of a community center on the south side of Chicago that offered psychological counseling services. It was free tuition in the city schools, all the things that we're saying everyday people need to survive and thrive. And I think in Chicago, it gave us a boost to be able to fight for something and not just react to something. But I did want to turn and actually ask two of the people who have been doing the on the ground work right now to say a word about what they have been involved in. Arewa Winters has her nephew was actually killed by the police when he was only 16 years old. But she has been incredibly involved in the consent decree process here in Chicago. So wanted to ask her to say a few words about that. And then Brianna Seslovich has also been part of the Care Not Cops efforts here at the university. So if the two of you could maybe just share a few words and any questions that you have for Alex and anyone else in the room. I think we can also open up the wisdom in the room. Arewa, do you want to?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me, Alice?
Yes.
Okay, because my camera is off. But yeah, so Arewa Karen Winters, founder of the 411 Movement for Pierre Laurie. My great nephew was shot and killed in 2016 in the North Lawndale community in Chicago. And I immersed myself into the work of reform the very next day. So I also became a part of Justice for Families, which was a branch of Black Lives Matter Chicago. And we were a part of a team of other organizations that filed the first ever lawsuit against the city of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department for a consent decree after Laquan McDonald's execution and the uncovering and just the whole backstory brought the Department of Justice here, which they should have been here, but brought the Department of Justice in to really kind of dissect our police department. And, we're able to document for themselves because we knew, already, and we have been telling them already, the systemic racism, the excessive violence, the murders where, officers were just being held unaccountable. So I don't even know how to say it, but the consent decree, it wasn't exactly what we wanted. It was a hell of a fight. It still is. They are failing horribly at it, but it is a matter of checks and balances. I believe that, I'm not opposed to abolition, but I'm not there in my personal development as of yet. And reform is just tangible for me. But it is like the same thing that they say about faith when they say, faith without work is dead. And it's the same thing about reform. Reforms without work is dead. And so, even with the consent decree, there's maybe about 14 organizations that filed a lawsuit, but it may only be about 13 people in a city of 2 million people actually doing the heavy lifting. And so that is another reason why we're not seeing the results that we want to see, that we fought for, because it's so few of us. I mean, we have no resources, everybody is volunteering their time, and we're going against two multi-million, billion-dollar corporations, and that's the city of Chicago and CPD, trying to, get these changes made. But it is a process. We're in the fight. Even today, speaking of Laquan McDonald, they are downtown protesting at the Federal Plaza because Jason Van Dyke was due to be released today, and they are wanting to bring federal charges, civil rights violations against him, and hoping that he gets more time in prison for the execution of Laquan McDonald, the young man who he shot 16 times in a public execution. So I think that's all I have, but just real quick, one last thing. And so right now we also have a police oversight ordinance, and it's called Empowering Communities for Public Safety. And so this is where we have 7 people, a 7-people commission, and a 66-person council, and that's three community members for each policing district, whereas they will have enforcement powers. They will have the ability to be able to get rid of the superintendent, get rid of the head of the police board, and get rid of the head of COPA, which is the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. So right now, Chicago has 2 historic things going for them, and that is consent decree, and now it is this community oversight of our policing system. But it's all new, and it is all only happening because of the work of the people. And that is primarily the Black and brown people that are taken to the streets, that are in these courtrooms, that are in these meetings and pushing, for these changes to happen. So that's all I think I have. And I don't have any questions right now, Alice. And thank you so much for allowing me time to share.
Thanks so much for that update, Arewa, and for all that you're doing. Brianna, do you want to say a word right now?
Sure. First, I'll just clarify that I am not officially affiliated with Care Not Cops. I'm just a giant supporter. And so I want to give credit where credit is due to the folks doing organizing and public education work through Care Not Cops, first and foremost, and to uplift what's already been put in the chat, but also the thread that I just linked. I'm a first-year doc student at UChicago, and I'm coming from being a mental health social worker in New York City just before this. So I just wanted to sort of thank Alex, first of all, for his contribution. I think this book meant a lot to me while I was working in the field and running up against this challenge in New York City of New York City claiming that there's a mobile crisis team system available for clients like mine who were clients of a public defender, while also recognizing that in order to connect them with this mobile crisis team, whenever I would make a phone call to the system, they would advise me that because my client was legally involved, a cop was going to come out with whoever else on the mobile crisis team was deployed for them. And I think that to sort of contextualize this for a lot of us UChicago affiliates, there's something really disturbing to me about the university's response to a police officer who's been involved in 2 incredibly violent incidents that have actually targeted people having mental health crises. One recently and one less recently, one involving a student and the other involving a community member. But in both cases, the same officer being involved. And I think that in a scenario like that, where a person has called for help in a crisis situation, it's alarming to think that police officers are the ones who are positioned as helpers or the ones who are positioned as being able to provide any useful service. So I just want to sort of contextualize the real recency and immediacy of this for those of us who, in a lot of ways, have an occupying police force that has really commanded a huge policing presence in not just our campus area, but our surrounding community area in our name. And so part of what I would invite folks to do is connect with Care Not Cops and start thinking about what it means for this violent occupying presence to be in the surrounding area in our name. I'll also drop some links to the very, very shoddy public accountability mechanisms that are available from University of Chicago's Department of Public Safety and Security. And I think that this speaks in a large way to Alex's points in his book about the real limitations of things like oversight committees, especially for privatized police forces that don't even have to be accountable in any sort of public way, which is the case at UChicago. So I think that, the challenge certainly is really abundant to me as a newcomer to this community, that there are not a lot of resources being devoted to thinking critically about what accountability or constraints on police power would look like for this massive privatized policing force that works hand in hand with Chicago Police Department and also a number of other police departments in the state. With that being said, I do think that one of the questions that I'm coming with is a question around the rhetoric of public safety. I know that it's in the book title. And I know that it's also something that's really clung to in the context of University of Chicago Police Department being housed within the Department of Safety and Security. And so I wonder, Alex, if you have thoughts or recommendations for us to consider when trying to dismantle the very broad scope of police in all aspects of our lives in terms of providing alternative mechanisms for promoting public safety or redefining public safety or thinking about what public safety can look like without the presence of police.
Thanks. I mean, this is such a huge challenge, right? Because we have experienced generations of propaganda telling us that police equals public safety. Every television show, every nightly news broadcast, every political speech tells us that the only way to get safety is with policing. And so then when people hear a phrase like, defund the police or abolish police, they think, oh, you want to take away the one thing we've been told we can have, as imperfect as it is, to make ourselves safe. So it's incredibly important that we constantly disrupt this equation, that we point out the ways in which police produce unsafety, the ways they fail to produce safety, and concrete examples of how we can produce safety better. And this is not faith or abstraction or utopianism. We have interventions right now that could be implemented tomorrow that would be better at producing safety than policing, that are evidence-based, and that certainly are better than any of the reforms that are being talked about, almost none of which have any evidence to support them. Body cameras, implicit bias training, community policing. Every study shows they don't work. There is no evidence that shows that this, where are the evidence-based intervention? Where's the evidence that shows that the war on drugs is working? Where's the evidence that shows that school policing is keeping our kids safe? It's not. Every study ever done shows that school policing does not keep kids safer. It doesn't work. And yet always, oh, where's the evidence that says we have all the solutions already worked out? Well, we do have a lot of solutions. We have evidence behind them that the police could never match up to in what they do. So again, I think primarily we need to go positive. We need to talk about what our communities need to be safer. And I just want to take a second to talk about accountability, if I could, right? Obviously, we have a culture of impunity in policing. There's nothing special about Chicago. Every city I go in, unfortunately, there is a family telling the same story. The impunity, the resistance to accountability, the failure of accountability implementation, this is the story. There is no other story. There are no examples. There are zero examples of how this struggle for accountability has made policing better. It doesn't exist. In part because it makes two kind of fundamental mistakes. One is it imagines that the problem of policing is encapsulated in these horrific high-profile killings. And that if we just tried to reverse engineer a solution to that killing, we would fix policing. But this is not going to work because the abuse of policing is millions of unnecessary, oppressive, counterproductive interactions between police and the public. Whether it is a ticket for a moving violation, a low-level drug arrest, or shooting someone to death in the middle of a mental health crisis. The other problem is that it assumes that somehow the police are not doing what they've been told to do. But we are getting exactly the policing that our political leaders want for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our political leaders, from the mayor of Chicago across the country have made very clear that they're extremely happy that the police are doing what they're doing. And that is why they do everything they can to block anything, any kind of alternative. This is why the reforms never make any difference, because the police are doing what they've been asked to do. And the solution to that is to take away their power to ruin our lives, to get them out of our lives in as many ways as we possibly can. And no amount of civilian oversight is going to achieve that, in my view. If we want to hold someone accountable, let's start with the mayor, who signs the collective bargaining agreements, who subverts the reform agendas and turns every social problem in our most vulnerable communities over to the police to manage. That's where the real accountability is. And civilian review boards and civilian complaint boards have been used historically by these political leaders to divert our movements into reforms that don't work and never will.
Thanks for that, Brianna. Thanks, Alex. You know, I see that some questions are coming up in the chat now, and a few people have also DM'd me specific questions. So I think I want to hand it over to Julian to moderate sort of a discussion with everyone in the Zoom room so we can get that going and not run out of time. And I have plenty of questions I could ask you, Alex, but I'll jump in and chime in if time allows.
I'll try to be efficient.
Thanks, Alice. So Alice, do you have some people who DM'd you who want to go ahead first, and you can call on them?
Monica Cosby. Monica, would you like to share your question?
I don't know if I'm going to say this the right way, because I hear evidence-based get tossed around in like all kind of spaces, right? Evidence-based this and evidence-based that. And I'm always like, all the evidence that the police don't work is already here, right? It is in the lived and living experiences of me and Herrera and so many more of us, right? And so I'm just like wondering who decides what the fucking evidence is. You know what I'm saying? Who decides what it is, and why aren't we are the evidence? Those people that are getting the evidence is already here. I don't know if I'm saying any of this.
Yeah, that is a great, really important question. And it's super important at a place like the University of Chicago, because the University of Chicago has a whole raft of people who think the world is limited to what they can prove in an experimental quantitative study. And if it doesn't exist as a quantitative experimental study, then it just doesn't exist.
3 women
Right,
a day, they like anybody can check all the statistics from everywhere. 3 women a day are killed by a current or former intimate partner. Like I can shout, and I'm sure everybody here already knows these things, right? So that's like evidence already. I'm not
Exactly.
trying to
So the folks who tell us that policing is a good idea, they base it on a handful of these very specific experimental studies. That is the only evidence that they consider to be valid. And in the process, they erase the vast majority of lived experience. They just dismiss, they don't even accept the possibility that they just don't know. They're like, but we had a study one time 10 years ago in a city on the other side of the country during an anti-terrorism raid that showed that having 3 extra police officers prevented a car theft. And therefore, policing works now and forever, everywhere. And so I'm agreeing with you that academic criminologists have been primary tools of enabling policing by the mobilization of a certain type of data that is, in my view, completely inaccurate and indefensible, and erasing the experience of the vast majority of people in our society.
Great, thank you so much.
this
So
shit makes me
I'll
so
start.
sick.
Oh, sorry. Do you have a follow-up, question, Monica?
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Monica.
Thank you so much. I have a Kavia Kosla who has their hand up, and if you want to speak, please unmute yourself and raise your hand. And others, please let me know in chat if you'd like to ask a question, and also raise your hand so you'll have double ways to get at you.
I had put it in the chat, so you can ignore that, or to Alice. But my question is, I don't know, maybe there are other ways to get educated by going to group meetings and stuff. So I apologize if this is a bit of a redundant question, but I feel like a lot of the, as a student and activist, a lot of the solutions that we hear about in community meetings about this are around mental health crises, and crises where we have a clear service like social services in place to call instead of the police. And I'm curious, when there is a criminal or actually unsafe event happening, but we don't trust the police, and there is some justice that we feel needs to happen in that case, but the police isn't trusted and they might not even get us justice. What is do we have an evidence-based thing that we point towards to call instead of the police, or is that where the police needs to be reformed in order to deliver that justice for us? And yeah.
All right, so this is the classic question. What do we do if we don't have police? So first, we have to be very specific about what the problem is that we think we're trying to address here and what we mean by justice. So it's very hard to go through the whole range of all this. This is extremely complicated, right?
Yeah.
We need different kinds of interventions, for instance, to deal with intimate partner violence than we do to like stranger rape. So we have to talk specifically about different kinds of harms that people are at risk of, and then develop strategies. And there is no perfect solution. There will be harms in our society, and we will need ways to address the aftermath of those harms. Three things to keep in mind, though, about when we think that policing is the solution. One is we grossly overestimate its effectiveness. The vast majority of serious violence and harm is never even reported to the police now. The cost of policing, as I mentioned before, that even when police respond, it often produces more harm than good. And third, the kind of the ideological, the third thing is that we do have lots of alternatives, but they have to be tailored to the specific needs. So one of the reasons that policing is sold, one of the ways policing is sold to folks at the University of Chicago is that, well, we need it to protect female members of our community, right? From sexual assaults and harassment, things like that, from violence. But what is the level of services available to women on the campus who are experiencing mental health problems, intimate partner conflicts, have experienced date rape? Like, have they really designed the system with the well-being of women in mind? Is there not an ongoing problem of sexual harassment on the campus that the college, that the university prefers to kind of paper over because it might hurt their admission standards, right? So we see routinely universities covering up the harms that female students experience while heavily funding their police departments. And I don't know when a campus police department prevented an incident of date rape, right? They don't do that. They're not capable of doing that. So there are lots of ideas about interventions, civilian crisis teams, neighborhood-based violence interrupters, domestic violence support centers. So we have some answers to that, but to get into the specifics is very time consuming. Derica Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionist, talks about this nicely.
Thank you, Kavia. As some of you gather some other thoughts for your questions, I thought maybe I'd ask one sort of, I was thinking about this as you were speaking, Alex, and going back to some of the questions about evidence-based solutions, but also the way in which University of Chicago and other sort of sociologists, criminologists will just point to all kinds of studies to try to prove their point and that are really limiting in so many ways. One of the kinds of series of studies that I always hear about, and I'd love to hear your response to this, Alex, when I talk to people about alternatives to public safety beyond policing, you know, something that I always get thrown at me is, well, such and such study shows conclusively that the more police that are in the neighborhoods, the more boots on the ground, it's shown conclusively to decrease criminal violence, violent crimes. I know that you're probably familiar with this argument, and I know that I would guess you have a response for that. So how should we think about those kinds of arguments that, you know, that just say, well, look, more police equals less violent crime, and you can look at stats to prove that. How would you address that?
Well, it's just not true.
That comes up?
It's just not true. Even the studies they point to don't even claim that. They're like, oh, we got a 3% reduction in burglaries or something. Well, that's not a violent crime. That's not the problem we're trying to address here. These studies just don't say that. I mean, these are studies that, first of all, are almost entirely produced by economists and a few psychologists who actually know nothing about the communities they're talking about. They know nothing about policing. They know about data sets and math, and they're correlation shopping with a political agenda. This is not neutral science. This is politically motivated science. And the conclusions are just ridiculous most of the time. And in some cases, they're trying to hijack research where the researchers themselves have said, quit saying that this is what my study says. My study does not say this. Quit using it to bolster this idea. One of the major flaws is this idea of infinite elasticity, right? They're like, well, because one time in one place, we showed some change in the policing numbers produced some positive outcome. Therefore, an addition of a police officer is worth this much crime savings. And therefore, if one cop prevented 5 crimes, 50 cops will prevent 25 crimes, and 500 cops, 250, right? And then just on and on and on. Well, this is just ridiculous. We have the actual history of police research shows that this is not true, that there's never been an overall correlation between police head counts and crime rates, especially not violent crime rates. And I'll just give one last example. In the way in which they just don't look at just the basic facts about how the world actually works. Michael Bloomberg was mayor of New York for 12 years, and almost every one of those 12 years, he reduced the head count of the NYPD through attrition, and every year violent crime went down. So, I mean, what more evidence do you need?
Right. Thanks. That's really helpful. Thank you. I have a question from Maya Van Nuys. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Sure, thanks so much. Alex, I was just curious to hear more about sort of like this idea. I think mutual aid and transportive justice really centers the community as the level with which change should happen, and that the community members keep communities safe. And I do truly believe that. But I'm also curious, like, how do activists as well as scholars, particularly rhetorically and even actual organization-wise, approach the idea that community is the center kind of change, but at the same time, there's so many laws and practices operating not at the community level that produce violence?
Yeah, this is a super important challenge to think about, and I can not really do the thing justice in this setting, but what we're really talking about here is the appropriate role of the state, of government. And the transformative justice movement emerged out of communities that were so alienated by a state that was overwhelmingly hostile to their best interests. And they have done the best they can to try to cobble together resources to keep themselves as safe as they can in the presence of a hostile state. And I think this is fantastic, and we should do everything we can to build this out, to support it, to hold it, to lift it up as a way forward. But those community-based processes cannot change the underlying politics of austerity, neoliberal globalization that is producing these kinds of neighborhood conditions that people are struggling to address. So my view has been that we need to develop new logics at the community level around public safety, rooted in care, compassion, and solidarity, rather than control, coercion, and violence. And that is central to building a politics that at some future point might be capable of delivering real political transformation, not little incremental spending improvements, but real transformation. So is transformative justice capable of transforming society on its own terms? I don't think so. But I think it's a crucial part of building for those bigger changes.
Great, thank you. If there's any more questions, please do put them in the chat and raise your hand. In the meantime, I know maybe Alice, you had another question for Alex that you wanted to put on the floor. Oh, you're muted still.
You know, I'm really glad that earlier in your talk, you brought up the ideological costs of policing. And I think that it's come up in Brianna's question and sort of undergirds a lot of the questions here, right? The ideology, carceral logic. And I'm wondering if you could go a little bit deeper in terms of what you just said, you know, really building a politic of love, solidarity, caring, compassion. And what does that look like in practice?
There was an expression in the social movements of the 1960s that you have to kill the cop in your head. And that's a real challenge for us, right? Because we live in an authoritarian culture. And I struggle with this with my own children, you know, that impulse to police my children through control and coercion, because it is, you know, so at the heart of our culture. And it seems like in a way, in the path of least resistance. But of course, what we learn is that it's incredibly counterproductive, right? When we abuse our children by policing them in these coercive and violent and threatening ways, we produce children who have difficulties managing in the world without relying on those same techniques. So we reproduce the problem. And this is incredibly hard to talk to people about in some ways. I mean, when we expose people to intergenerational trauma and abuse, going back to the legacies of slavery and colonialism, right? And then we say, oh, well, you're engaged in violence or supporting coercive measures because you're a bad person or something. No, we have these unresolved traumas that drive us to these harmful ways of interacting with each other. And to think that we can fix this with just one, you know, a couple of hours of getting together in a circle, or if that's also naive, right? These are going to be long-term processes. What I think is super important, though, is that people attach themselves to intentional communities to whom they are accountable for building a better world and a better self. That we can't fix this as free-floating individuals with salty Twitter feeds, right? We have to be involved in collective struggle.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, that's great. Go ahead, Alex.
I had an anonymous question, a question that wants to be posed anonymously, come to me in the chat. But I also wanted to really agree with what you just said, Alex, and moving towards these kinds of practices individually and also very locally, I think can really help us shift even our own thinking, even those of us who are abolitionists, are fighting against police, are fighting for abolition. And I'm thinking of something Miriam Kaba often says in her talks and advises people to do in their own communities, to develop their own restorative justice practices at their own workplaces, in their own organizations, because harm is inevitable, right? It's inevitable, and we need to figure out ways to actually deal with harm and address harm differently than maybe our institutions do. Or if we're saying don't call the police, what do we actually have in place to offer people? So I appreciate that. And this question is, if you could speak to the privatization of prisons and the supply and demand in that situation that affects and incentivizes policing and interactions with Black and Brown communities.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. You know, the film, The 13th, about the 13th Amendment, that points out that, you know, they abolish slavery except for those convicted of a crime. That film and a discourse that surrounds it has been really important to opening some people's eyes about some of the kind of immediate commercial interests involved in mass incarceration. But this is not actually how we're going to fix this problem. Private prisons, while abhorrent, are a symptom of austerity politics and neoliberalism. They're not a cause of it. And they're certainly not a cause of mass incarceration. Here in New York State, where I live, we don't have any private prisons. We don't have any commercial prison labor for corporations, and we got plenty of mass incarceration. The problem of mass incarceration is so much bigger than the gravy that falls off the plate to Sodexo and the phone companies and a few private prison companies. That is just gravy falling off the plate. When we understand that mass incarceration is a tool for enabling the massive redistribution of wealth at the heart of neoliberal austerity politics, we see that what incarceration is enabling is not a few $100 million in prison contracts. It's enabling trillions of dollars to be redistributed up the economic ladder. That's what's at stake here, not a few prison contracts. So, you know, I worked with Bernie Sanders's team on his platform around criminal justice during the presidential election, and this was one of his big things, get rid of private prisons. And I'm like, that's fine, but that is not the solution to any of the problems we're trying to fix.
Great, thank you. Alice, do you have any more in your queue?
I might have one final question for you, Alex.
Go ahead.
This is really coming from students and fellow organizers, activists who are incarcerated. I teach at Stateville Prison, which is a maximum security prison for men. And the think tank, you know, during the height of the protests around George Floyd, and then, you know, the coronavirus pandemic, and all of the efforts that folks were making around policing and the pandemic, people inside were really calling for more connections to be made. In some ways, it's so obvious, right? Because, and you just spoke to it. But they were calling for more connections to be made in the actual movement and organizing, right? So that policing, the anti-police violence movement, seemed to be such a different and separate thread. It's so siloed from, you know, the anti-prison movement or prison conditions. So if you could speak to how we could get those two movements working together, that would.
I think it's beginning to happen. And I will say one of the main motivations for me writing this book is that I felt there was something missing in what was the dominant abolitionist discourse at the time, which was almost entirely focused on prisons. I was around for the formation of critical resistance and an early supporter of those efforts. I was involved in campaigns to roll back the Rockefeller drug laws here in New York State. I mean, that's all tremendously important, but no one goes to prison unless they've been arrested by police. Police are the gateway to this whole process. And also, police independently produce a tremendous amount of harm that has nothing to do with people ending up in prison. I mean, they literally kill over 1,000 people a year. And that has nothing to do with mass incarceration. And the harassment, the verbal abuse, the needless low-level enforcement directed at the most vulnerable people in our communities rarely involves state prison terms. Cycling in and out of courts, jails, rehabilitation facilities, paying fines and fees. So we have to build policing into our analysis around the harms of mass incarceration. At the same time, we also have to keep the lives of incarcerated people forefront in our minds. I am involved in correspondence with people. I've made hundreds of copies of the book available to people who are incarcerated. I speak regularly in prisons. So it is essential that we connect these dots.
Thanks. I have one more question that came in. David Cruz, I don't know if you want to ask this question or if you'd like me to ask it.
It's okay, you could ask it. I'm at work.
Okay, David is asking, how far do you think the city of Chicago is from defunding the police? And I will also throw the question to Alex in terms of New York. How far do you think the city of New York is from defunding the police?
When is Lori Lightfoot next up for election?
2023.
Yeah, that's part of the answer, right? Is that as long as people vote for her, you're not going to get the kind of community safety that you want. She's made that very clear, unambiguously.
Thank you.
I think in New York, we have a little bit of a complicated situation because we have a mayor who has embraced this bellicose language about policing. But we have a city council that was elected at the same time with massive support for reducing spending on policing and investing in community-based alternatives. So we're going to have a lot of interesting battles here in New York around budgetary priorities.
Okay, well, we are approaching time. I want to thank Alice and Alex and all of you for your questions and for joining us today. And I hope we can continue the struggle and keep this community and conversations going. And so please join me in thanking Alice and Alex. It was wonderful for them to take out their time to join us. And we've learned so much from you. Thanks again. And I hope to see you all sometime soon in some other capacity.
Hopefully in person.
Hopefully in person next time, yes. Take care.
Good night, everybody.